Hey everyone, for this video I wanted to do something a little bit different, and I've actually been wanting to take a closer look at some of these tools for a while, but this is a great opportunity to take a good look at a new tool from Topaz Labs called Photo AI. Now, I've been using the Topaz Labs DeNoise and Gigapixel and Sharpen for a few years now, and overall I've been really happy with them, but there are a few annoyances as well. First of all, the output is not always as good as I would like it to be. I tend to see that especially on the Sharpening AI tool, where I see some artifacting coming into images or edges just not looking very clean and whatnot. But the bigger thing is, honestly, it's frustrating to try to figure out sometimes which of the Topaz apps you need to use. On a particular image, do I need to use DeNoise because it was shot at higher ISO, or is the Sharpen AI tool going to be the way I need to go because it also does some denoising? Or will DeNoise and the default sharpening tools that are built into it allow you to get to the point where you need to be? So the whole point of this new Topaz Photo AI that's coming out next month in September, as I recorded this, in August 2022, is to basically give you a one-stop shop or one-click solution for taking an image into this new Photo AI tool and having it automatically determine what is actually needed to get you the best results in terms of image quality. So again, I'm recording this in August of 2022, and Photo AI officially is due out next month. But if you are a subscriber to their image quality bundle, which includes the DeNoise, Gigapixel, and Sharpen AI tools, you can get early access to this Topaz Photo AI piece of software already in beta form. The version I'm going to be showing you today is version 0.8, so this is not the final version. Things may get better, they may add in some additional features, they may actually remove some features. I do know that there's a couple things in this latest version that in their community forum they are openly stating that based on feedback and usability that may get pulled. It's nothing I'll be showing today, I don't believe, but just keep in mind, this is an early look at the software. I'd say it's close considering the public release is due out in a matter of weeks at this point, but do keep in mind that this is not the final version. As far as the image quality bundle and getting this early access, as you can see on screen right now, the bundle is normally $260 US. Currently, it is $60 off, so you can get all three of those applications for basically $200. Now, admittedly, that's not a small fee, but the saving grace here is that comes with a full year of upgrades to each of the apps. So as new versions are released for the next 12 months after you sign up, you'll get all those updates for free. And secondly, this is a lifetime license to each of those apps as well. So even after that 12-month free update window expires, you still have full access to the last version you updated to indefinitely. So there's no losing your license and having to check in online and finding out that it's expired or anything like that. So honestly, for the three programs for $200, it's actually, in my opinion, a pretty good deal. I actually just renewed mine. Actually, I let it lapse a little bit, so I wasn't able to get updates for about 9 months. And if I remember correctly, it was $79.99 to renew my licenses for the ongoing updates for another year. So once you buy in, at least right now, it's about $80 a year to keep access to updates for another 12 months. Now, all that said, I do want to make it clear, I am an affiliate for Topaz Labs. I'll give the usual disclaimer here in that I generally do not, I shouldn't say generally, I do not sign up to become an affiliate with a company unless it's a tool I currently use or have used in the past and truly believe in. So take that for what it is. My intent here is to give an honest look at what the new Photo AI tool is capable of in terms of the all-in-one solution and one-button solution. But it is worth knowing I am an affiliate. That said, of course, if you'd like to go ahead and sign up for the image quality bundle and get the early access to Photo AI, I would love it if you'd use the affiliate link that I've got down in the description below, as I do get a small commission off that, and that's a great way to help support this channel and my photography journey in general. But I also need to point out that I do not know at this point if Photo AI is going to be included as part of the image quality bundle once it becomes officially available in September, or if it's going to be a separate cost. I've reached out to Topaz and asked that question. I haven't heard anything back yet, so I haven't been able to confirm what the status of Photo AI is going to be upon its actual release. The way it's worded here, it sounds like it's going to be included, but I don't know, and I don't want to clearly state that and end up having you find out, and myself find out, that to get the actual release next month in September, that there is an additional charge. So fingers crossed it will be continued to be included. But again, I don't know if it's free right now just because it's in the beta, or if it's going to be a free part of the image quality bundle going forward. So all that blathering out of the way, I'm going to jump over to Lightroom and start taking a look at things there. Now, I've got a large selection of photos selected in Lightroom that I want to take a look at. I've got nearly 30 photos. These span all the way back to 2017 when I was still using my crop sensor Canon 80D, all the way up to more recent photos taken over the last few years, both with my Canon R and my Canon R5. So you can see how this works across different cameras, different ISO settings, different lenses, the whole bit. Now, I've got nearly 30 photos here. I'm not going to walk through all 30 of these in the video, but what I want to do is I've got a blog post written up where I talk about what I'm seeing in terms of Photo AI. I'm going to do some comparisons against the standalone DeNoise and Sharpen AI tools as well to see how the Photo AI results stack up against those. But then I've also got a file you can download so you can take a closer look at the images themselves, the before and after, the ones where I've compared against the standalone Topaz apps. I'll include those also. I'm fully aware that I'm doing a screen recording, so it may be harder to pick up some of the fine details that I'll be covering here in this video. And on top of that, you're watching this on YouTube, which has their own compression, and maybe you've got slower internet, it's not streaming at the greatest resolution, yada, yada, yada. So if you go to my blog post for this, you'll be able to download so you can get a good, detailed, high-resolution comparison of the output of each of the apps side by side, so you can make a determination for yourself in terms of how the results look. The other thing I'm going to focus on here is the intent of this video is not to do a step-by-step walkthrough of everything within Photo AI. There are some tools in that new application that I'm not going to be looking at here. For instance, the latest versions added in some raw processing capabilities. It looks like it's very rough and very early, and I think that's one of the tools that they may pull out for the official release if they feel it's not quite where it needs to be yet. But I'm not going to be showing anything like that. What I want to show here again is from an image quality standpoint and a quality improvement standpoint, how does this new tool do with essentially a single click solution compared to having to figure out, again, which Topaz app do I need to use? Do I need to use DeNoise? Do I need to use Sharpen? Do I need to go into Gigapixel and upsize? You can do the upsizing within this Photo AI as well. Again, I'm not going to be showing that here because I really want to focus on the image quality improvements. So as the British would say, enough waffling, let's just get on into this. So this first image I have is the oldest image in this little collection I put together. It's from 2017. It was on my Canon EOS 80D, which is a crop sensor. Not a bad camera, but it's a crop. It's an older camera. Image quality is not on par with a full frame, typically speaking. It was also using the EF 75 to 300 millimeter, which is essentially a kit lens and notoriously known for not having the best image quality to begin with. If I zoom in on this image, it's not terrible. It's a little soft. The bird is probably not quite as detailed as I would like. The only thing I've done to this image in terms of cleanup is I think I bumped the exposure a little bit, and then I did remove some defringing that was creeping in on the branches and the bird. That is definitely a big issue with that 75 to 300 kit lens. It introduces a lot of purple fringe, so I've removed that through the lens corrections module. Other than that, this is a quote-unquote bone stock image. Now, what I'm also going to do, though, is go into the develop panel. Again, you can see where I've removed that purple fringe. But I also want to come down to details and make sure I don't have any pre-applied sharpening or noise reduction from within Lightroom. Now, the color reduction, I'm going to leave that at its default of 25. Noise reduction by default is at 0. On my Canon cameras, the default for sharpening always bumps it up to 40. It's not a huge difference. You may not even be able to pick it up as I remove it. It's going to get a little bit softer, but I really want to see how good is this Photo AI tool coming from a 0 baseline standpoint. So I've turned off sharpening completely on the image, and now we can see again that bird's a little bit soft. Let me actually bump this to 200%, which I normally wouldn't do, but now you can see even more so that bird is pretty soft as we zoom further in here, as are the tree branches. Some of this, again, is going to be the lens, but it's a good example in terms of finding out just what can this Photo AI tool do with a single click. So I'm just going to right click on the image. I'm going to come over to Edit In. And since I've already got Photo AI installed, it's in my selection of external applications. So I'm going to click on Topaz Photo AI and let it do its thing. Oh, first I need to tell it what we want to do. And actually there's only one option, is editing a copy with the Lightroom adjustments. That's going to take what I've done in terms of removing the sharpening, removing that purple fringe, and bringing that on into Photo AI. As far as my copy file options, I'm going to leave it as a TIFF. You could do it as a PSD or a JPEG, but TIFF is going to retain the most data in a format that makes the most sense in terms of working out of Lightroom. Leaving it in Photo RGB, definitely leaving it in 16 bits as opposed to 8 bits. Resolution 300 is fine, and I don't want to do any compression. So now I'm going to hit Edit. Lightroom's preparing the TIFF file. And now we've got Photo AI loading up. So if you look down in the lower left here, it's currently scanning the image. It's making a determination of what corrections need to be applied. If you look in the upper right, you can see that it's detected a subject. It's detected no faces. It says the subject is in focus. The luminance noise level is severe. So at this point, it is still assessing quality, and boom, now it just snapped in that the preview is updated to have the applicable adjustments applied to it. Now what's interesting is that it's saying that there's a subject detected, and if I hover on it, I'm not entirely sure what it's picking up as the subject. So to me, this is an example of, again, this is a beta version of the software. It's version 0.8, not even up to version 1 yet. So theoretically, this masking is one of the pieces that still need to be tweaked before it comes out in the coming weeks. Now, one unfortunate thing here that's missing currently in this beta version is there's no way you can adjust the masks. So unfortunately, whereas with Sharpen AI or DeNoise AI, you can go in with a mask adjustment and brush a mask in or out. That's not available in Photo AI yet. I suspect it is coming. Whether it's going to be there for the full release, I don't know. If it's not, hopefully it comes very soon thereafter. But I'm keeping my fingers crossed that it is there on day one, once this officially becomes available. So anyways, we've walked through what it automatically detected. I'm a little surprised that it indicates the subject is in focus, but again, that's where the guessing game comes into it. Sometimes high ISO and grain or noise in the image makes an image look soft, but it's really just the quote-unquote fuzziness that's brought about because of all the noise in the image. So if I drag this over here, it's going to take a moment to update the preview again. It's done so. So we can see this is looking fairly good. Now you say, well, what's the before, what's the after? Right now, we're looking at the improved version, the quote-unquote improved version. You can see the hand cursor on the screen here. If I click and hold on the image, it's going to show me the original version. So I'm going to click and hold, and you can see that, and again, it's subtle, surprisingly subtle, but as I'm holding down the mouse button, this is the original version. You can see it's a little softer. As soon as I let go, it's going to pop in. And you can see, honestly, it's subtle, but it's definitely significant or noticeable level of sharpness improvement. And it's doing that through the remove noise tool. Now, the other thing I can do here is zoom in further. So if I zoom in to 200%, it's going to update the preview again. Let's move that and get that more in the center. So now you can see where it's fallen apart maybe a little bit. It is improving things a bit, but at the end of the day, this is a pretty low quality file to begin with. And I suspect that any tool I use, there's only so much that's going to be able to be done. But again, it's still an improvement. The other thing I can do here is do a slider view. So if I drag this left and right, I can see before and after across the image. So you can see there is a significant difference in terms of sharpness. I do see some artifacting come into the mix. However, again, we've got to remember I'm in at 200%. I never will look at an image at 200%. If I were to print this image, I'd basically be holding it up to my nose to get an equivalent view of this 200%. So this is an extreme pixel peeping scenario here. So you do have to keep that in mind. So some of the artifacting you're seeing, and then maybe some other imperfections that it's just not able to correct for in this file, this is an extreme example just for the sake of showing you the difference it's making. The other option we have is we can do a side-by-side. So on the left is the original, and on the right is the Photo AI corrected output. Now, obviously, there's no face recovery being done here because there's no faces detected, so we're not going to worry about that. If I click on Remove Noise, you do get a little bit of a drop down. You can choose from normal or strong. Now, to me, the whole point of this Photo AI is it's doing everything automatically. I'm not going to have to think or tweak or play with different settings and try to get the best results. Ideally, this is truly a one-click solution. However, you've still got the ability to override some of the settings. And again, you don't have the amount of depth of settings that you can tweak and adjust as you have in the standalone apps, because this is intended to be a simpler solution, but there are still some things you can do. So if I wanted to say, I think it's being a little too aggressive, I could click on normal. Now you can see that instead of saying we're using the autopilot settings, this button up here is changed to reset to autopilot settings. So if I wanted to go back to what the AI tool identified, I can just click on this. You can see now it's bounced back to strong, and it matches the autopilot settings it identified. The other thing I can do, whether I switch it over to normal or leave it on strong, is I can adjust the strength. You can see this little green line, which indicates where the AI determined the level needed to be. But again, you do have the ability to tweak this a little bit. So I could really crank this up and give it a moment to re-render. Now that preview's updated, and I think it's pretty obvious that we've gone too far and it's overdone, and we've introduced a lot of artifacting. But you do have the ability to make some minor adjustments there as well. The other thing you can do is you can come in and still turn on the Sharpen tool, even though it wasn't identified as needed. Photo AI does let you still apply that. So you can see what happens if you try lens blur, and again, it's going to assess the quality and update the preview. I frankly don't think that is doing something. It's cleaning up some of that artifacting, but it's also kind of smoothing things out, oddly enough, and making them look a little muddy. But again, I can change the strength on this, let it recalculate. Preview updated. I can click and hold on the image to do a direct before and after. Now, here's a great example of something that's probably a bug in the beta version. If you watch these tree branches up here as it reassesses and applies, you can see that this is where we get into the problem with the current masking tools. So if you remember, that subject detected picked up some of these branches and the foliage and not the bird. That's where these effects are being primarily applied. So again, if I click and hold, it's the before and after. You can see definitely not what we want to do. So there is a slight improvement, or I can't say improvement, there's a slight impact on the bird here. And again, I don't know in the video that you can even see that. You're seeing a little bit more detail in its chest, and I accidentally moved it, so it's got to recalculate real quickly here. So if I show the before, you can see the details in those chest feathers get a little better. Around the eye, I think gets a little better. But where the issue comes in, obviously, is where that masking has been automatically applied that we don't have any way to remove right now. We've got a big issue there. So in terms of Sharpen, we're going to turn that off. The AI in this case determined that noise reduction is primarily what was needed. Now that does beg the question, what is it doing to the branches up there? Let me go back to just full screen view here. What is it doing to those branches that fell within that mask when we just do the noise reduction? So we're back to using the autopilot settings that it automatically determined for us. You can see where the subject is detected. So roughly in this area. That said, I don't think there's really any noticeable degradation or anything in the area. And we're still seeing improvement in the areas that weren't masked. If you watch down in this lower right corner, for instance, you can see the before. Again, hopefully this is picking up on the video, but on the before, there's quite a bit of grain, especially in those darker shadows. And in the after, that grain all gets moved out. Let me bump this back to 100% since that's a more realistic representation of how we're going to be using this tool. And again, before and after, it's a subtle change. You can take a look at the actual file via my blog post, but it is a pretty nice improvement. So at this point, let me save this back to Lightroom. It's going to do its processing. It's going to do its saving. And now here is that modified file. And again, I'm in Lightroom. I'm zoomed in at 200%. Let me select the modified and the original and go into library and comparison view, or I could have just hit C key. So we know this left version is the Photo AI quote unquote improved version because it's a TIFF. This is my original raw file. If I zoom in on the bird, give Lightroom a moment to snap in the load. And again, it's subtle, but definitely noticeable. It's overall cleaner, and there is some sharpness that's been improved as well. Even though it only used the DeNoise aspect of Photo AI, that process was enough to improve the sharpening. And if we bring this back out to 100%, I'm not going to say this is a portfolio worthy file at this point, but there is definitely some improvement from where we were before. Especially as we get into looking at some of these branches here. These are pretty blurry and muddy on the original raw file, and they look much sharper and cleaner over here on the Photo AI improved output. Same thing in the bark. It's a little soft and muddy in here, and it's looking much better. And if we zoom this back, we'll get this to about 200%. But you can see, especially when we go crazy and zoom all the way into this 200% level, definitely a lot of lacking detail in the tree over on the original raw file that we've been able to recapture or recover, as it were, within Photo AI. All right, let me hit the E key to go back to my regular loop view, and we'll jump to our next candidate, which is a totally different style photo. This is my pupper. Let me hit the I key again and get those details up. This was shot at ISO 800, f3.2, 1/5000th of a second, yada, yada, yada. But you can see it is definitely soft, and with that higher ISO, it's also a little bit muddy. If I reset this to 100%, you can see even at 100%, that eye is not very sharp, and we've got some noise in there as well because of the ISO 800, although it's not too bad because it's fairly well lit. So this will be a good candidate to take into Photo AI and see how it does. Does that subject mask detect that there's a dog partially behind the tree here and actually do the masking correctly? And secondly, is it going to rely on the denoise part of Photo AI, or is it going to rely on the sharpening? So once again, I'm going to right click, choose Edit In, Photo AI. We've already covered that, so I'm just going to hit Edit. And once again, lower left, it's scanning the image. Depending on your system, this will take anywhere from a few seconds to, if you're on a slower system or laptop, might be a minute, don't know. All right, preview is updated. You can see that it did detect a subject. No face is detected. Subject is in focus. I don't know that I would agree with that. Luminance noise level is severe. So let's hover on subject detected and see how it did. So again, this honestly is a fail right now. It got better, but that's a pretty poor subject detection mask. So as I mentioned earlier, I don't know that they're going to have the ability to modify masks ready to go for the official release. But based on what we're seeing here so far, I sure as heck hope so, because these automatic masks are needing some work. Now I can click the eyeball here, or hover on the eyeball, and have that turn on and off. I guess actually you can't click on it and just have the mask on at all times. So anyways, no face detected, of course. Like I said, I'm skeptical that it's saying that the subject is in focus, but it did determine that the luminance noise level is severe. So again, it's applied remove noise, strong. It's not quite at the level that the previous photo was. But if we look at the before and after, so I'm going to click and hold on the image. It is better, but honestly, I'm seeing most of the improvement not on the dog. So if you look at, especially the shadows right in this area, as I go to the before, the original version, they were pretty grainy, again, shot at ISO 800, and that gets cleaned up with the automatic adjustment. You can see that this tree branch gets cleaned up as well. But I think my main concern here is I'm not really seeing any improvement on the dog, who was even identified at least partially as being the subject. I don't really see, there's less noise in that eye. And let me take that into 200% so we can really look at this. The noise on the eye is definitely getting cleaned up. But the fact remains, this isn't a sharp photo. So why didn't it identify that it needed sharpening? So if I come into sharpening, I turn it on. Let's give it a moment for it to do its scanning. So now we've got sharpening applied. And there's no question, manually applying the sharpening here is definitely an improvement. Actually, if you look at this little score down in the lower right, this 52%, this is something that may not make it in the release, but this is a quality improvement score that they just added with this .8 release. So that's telling you by what percent has the image quality improved. So if I turn off sharpen, even Topaz's own algorithm, or however they're calculating that improvement score, is saying it's only improved by 1%, whereas if I turn on sharpen, it jumps to 52%. Now, I don't know how they're calculating that exactly, but it seems like definitely this is an area where there's opportunity for improvement before they get the final release out. Let's see how it does on his ear here. So before and after, there's definitely improvement by enabling the sharpening. So on one hand, you could say, well, this is really disappointing that it's not automatically identifying that itself. And it is disappointing. The whole point of this, again, is it's supposed to be a simplified, essentially one-click solution that identifies the issues for you and applies the tools that are needed to fix the issues. It's not doing that, but you do still have, and this is what I want to stress, you do still have the abilities I've shown to go in and manually apply the things that you feel need to be applied. Now, again, applying the sharpening, there's definitely some artifacting coming in, but I will once again shout it from the rooftops that we're at 200% magnification. That is an insane amount of magnification, not something that is realistic in terms of real world use. Again, if I printed this, it would either be printed massively and I'd be sitting or standing way too close to it to get this equivalent zoom, or I'd be holding the print, again, right up in my face, which is not a realistic use case. So if we come down and change this back to the 100% zoom, again, it's going to have to recalculate and apply that sharpening and denoise again. But I suspect that here we're going to see a pretty nice job. And I moved it again, so it's going to recalculate. So now if we look at before versus after, before versus after, if anything, it's a little aggressive on the sharpening, but the other thing we're seeing, just like on that previous image, that automatic mask was, I believe, and we'll take a look at it in a second, I believe it was on his ear and kind of through this general section of his face and not on the right side of his face or his nose. And if you look, we are seeing some probably a little aggressiveness in the sharpening in that general area. So if I hover on this, actually it didn't pick up his ear so much as the fur above and around his eye and the R left of his nose. So if you look at before and after, I guess that's actually being applied pretty evenly, but probably a little overdone. So again, we can come in here and we can lower that strength down. And even in the standalone apps, honestly, I find myself often dialing things back a little bit because I feel that they're a little bit too aggressive, at least on some images. But and now I think we're at a pretty good spot. We're getting detail back in his fur. We've got some decent sharpness back in his eye. And again, I nudged it a little bit, so it's going to have to recalculate. I think this is a pretty good result. Now, the other thing we can do is see, well, instead of motion blur, is it lens blur? So let's try that. It's done its calculations. And I keep nudging it. So the other thing you can do, so you don't have to worry about nudging it like I am and waiting for it to recalculate, you can use this eyeball icon down here to toggle before and after. And if you're not sure which status means before or after, you can look over on the left, no filters active. So when the eyeball is updated, you're seeing the original version. When it's not updated, you're seeing the Photo AI adapted version. Honestly, I think I might like the lens blur version better than the motion blur version. Not sure I like what it's doing to this little spot on the tree trunk. And it's getting a little aggressive down here in this patch of light. But I think in terms of on the dog, that may actually look better. Let's go back to the motion blur. It's going to recalculate. And lens blur. It's pretty close. I might like lens blur a little better. And here we can actually tell it to only apply these effects to the subject only. So if I was concerned about this patch on the branch or this lighter patch down here, those aren't part of the identified subject. So I could do that, and it'll mask those areas out from the sharpening. But the problem we have there, of course, is that it didn't pick up the full subject. So now we've sharpened his eye and part of his face, but not the rest of his face. But you do have that flexibility. Now, you may also be asking yourself, what is enhance? And that is a pretty good question. They don't do a great job of providing any kind of tooltips or anything. So out of all of these, remove noise, sharpen, resize is straightforward. Enhance is a little bit less so. So let's actually turn off sharpen. We've already turned on enhance. So now we can see before and after, before and after. Let me turn off noise and see if we can get a better feel. It kind of looks like enhance is just doing... Well, that's interesting. So enhance is... It's still cleaning the image up. I don't necessarily see any sharpening being applied. But that doesn't look too bad. We may need to take a look at this one on another image or two to get a feel for what's actually going on with this enhance tool. Now you can see what it's truly doing. I mean, they don't give an explanation via tooltip by hovering on it or anything like that, but it's essentially trying to identify, and again, you can manually override it. What is the status of this file essentially, and what are you trying to enhance the file for? So right now it's saying, well, this is a low resolution file. Maybe it's been cropped heavily or was taken on an old camera with a very low megapixel sensor or something like that. In this case, it wasn't necessarily, but that's what's selected by default. So if I come to natural, it'll run a different process on it. And again, we can look at before and after. It's not cleaning up the noise quite as well as the low resolution. So that's kind of interesting. So obviously, first of all, I would hope by release they provide some tooltips where you can hover on the different tools, and at least on an enhanced one, it tells you what exactly the intent of it is. Yeah, so it's cleaning up the image a little bit with this natural enhance option. But honestly, I think the low resolution one did a better job on its own. So I don't want to ramble on here too much. Let's take a look at some more images. But I think so far we're seeing a bit of a mixed bag, right? The subject detection definitely needs, frankly, I think a lot of work in the coming weeks before this goes to full release. I think it's interesting that if I reset this to the autopilot settings, again, it's only determining that noise needs to be removed and not that anything needs to be sharpened in the image. Surprising, even considering, that eye is in the subject detection part of the image, and that eye is clearly blurry. So it really surprises me that it's not detecting that there's an opportunity to apply that sharpening as well. But again, fortunately, we've got the ability to manually override that and apply some sharpening. So again, let's kick this back to Lightroom. And we can take a look at the file side by side again before we move on to the next image. And real quickly, let's just do the side-by-side comparison again. We'll hit the C button this time, or the C key. So now we can see we're at 100%. This is with the AI detected noise reduction on as well as the sharpening that I applied. And you can see there's definitely an improvement in the sharpness of his eye and the fur around his ear. On the downside, it's kind of brought some sharpness into the bark a little bit here that really shouldn't be there because it's more of a depth of field quality of the frame than a lens blur or motion blur or anything like that. It over sharpened this little patch of sunlight in here. Again, that's more of a depth of field piece. But generally speaking, I think this is done pretty good, although I just spoke too soon because here we've got a weird artifact in the branch back here. So that's interesting. It did a pretty nice job of sharpening this up, but that is obviously a problem. So again, for the fourth or fifth time, I'll just reiterate, this is the beta version. This is not finalized. There's going to be glitches and bugs. They're very upfront about that in their community forum. And we need to be cognizant of that as we look at these results. That is the first time in the little bit of playing around I've done with this that I've seen any kind of artifacting like that. But as far as what we've got in the results on the pup here, and especially zoomed out, it's hard to tell, but I can tell visually looking at this right in front of me that there's definitely improved sharpness on his face. Harder to tell it at the zoomed out view here, but you can certainly see it when I zoom in here. But that little artifact there, that's obviously a graphical glitch that shouldn't be there. But overall, other than that glitch, honestly, this is pretty good. It did a nice job on these leaves that should be out of focus still, but they're cleaned up. They're not as noisy. Even on his fur back here, we've got some nice details brought back in. Let me zoom in a bit. Again, about 200%. And you can see some of those finer white strands of fur. We've got those recovered in here pretty nicely compared to the original version. And there's a heck of a lot less noise in the file as well. So yes, there are some issues with this, but it's doing a pretty good job. And I'm not going to condemn the tool just yet, considering, again, this is a beta version. Let's look at another one with a pretty clearly defined subject here. So this one, this was with my 80D again, shot this time with a much better lens than the 75-300. This is with Tamron SP 70-200 Generation 2, which is a pretty impressive lens. I've been happy with this one. But I did shoot it at ISO 2000, which especially on the 80D is really high. Now let me get back to 100% zoom, but there's a lot of noise in here. This is a case, again, I think it looks soft because of the noise. I don't think it's actually technically out of focus, so it'll be interesting to see, again, how Photo AI makes that determination of what needs to be done. I would suspect it's only going to be doing the denoise, but there's a lot of fine details in the fur here, around the eye, the flowers, that I think we'll get a good representation of how it does with a lot of those little details like that, as well as we've got a pretty clearly defined subject here. So is it going to wet the bed again on subject detection, or is it going to do a better job on this one where, to me at least, that's a pretty darn clear subject in this frame? So right click, edit in, Photo AI, and we'll speed this up. All right, so now that it's done processing, before I even look to see, it says it's detected a subject, we'll hold off on that for just a second. As it stands right now, this looks pretty impressive. Now, I did just realize on this one and the previous one with the dog, I forgot to go into my develop settings in Lightroom and take the sharpening down to 0. Honestly, I don't think that really makes that much of a difference. The 40 points of sharpening that are applied in Lightroom, still the default value. I would take that up depending on the camera, the image, and so on and so forth. I'd probably take that up to anywhere from 60 to 70 points on that sharpening slider. So being at 40 is not the end of the world. But overall, I think if we look at the before and the after, certainly it did a great job of cleaning up that high ISO noise. Again, this was shot at ISO 2000, and it's doing a fantastic job of cleaning it up. Again, and we'll see what it's saying on the subject that's detected. It still looks a little soft to me. Now, I am nitpicking zoomed in at 100%, but I would definitely like to see some sharpness brought in around the eye. And, it looks like he's got some grasses or something laying in the bowl of his antler, for lack of a better way to put it. That maybe could be a little bit sharper. Yeah, I think the flowers look pretty good because they're starting to get into a little bit of depth of field focus limitations anyways. This flower here is probably on a similar plane to the moose, and it looks pretty good. These ones more in the foreground, these leaves that are a depth of field issue, it's cleaning those up, but it's not over sharpening them or anything where they shouldn't be. So let's see what it did on the subject detection. Okay. Let me actually, I'm going to zoom out. It's going to slow it down zooming out because it's got more pixels it's got to calculate on. Let's take this to, let's see if we can get the whole moose in with 67%. We can. Okay. Just about got them all in. So let it, okay, it's recalculated. And if we look at the subject detection, okay, there's some imperfections certainly, but definitely out of the subject detection we've seen in the first 3 images, by far it did the best job here. The only issues is obviously it's pulling in these flowers, these plants in the foreground. It's pulling in that little gap between the antlers, and it's bleeding a little outside the lines of the actual subject. But overall, it's done a much, much better job. And I think in general for the image as a whole, we're zoomed at 67%. We can still see, it's not impacting the ability of the application to do the cleanup it needs to do. Let's take this back to 100% real quickly. And let's just make sure we've got that eye and some of these antler details in. It's recalculated. Let's skip sharpen for now, and let's try enhance and see what happens this time. So again, it's defaulting to low resolution. Now that we've got that applied, this is the original raw. This is with both DeNoise and enhance. Let's turn enhance off and see what we get. I think in this case, I'm not really seeing a difference. Let's just try natural for the fun of it. Yeah, I think in this example, I'm not really seeing any benefit. We'll try the graphics just to be thorough here. Oh, that's interesting. I actually think the graphics looks pretty good. Let's disable it. So this is just with the automatic noise removal. And if we turn on enhance with graphics, there's definitely a difference there. And oh, this is interesting. Okay. So again, mixed mixed results. If you look at the eye specifically and the head, I think there's a definite improvement when we turn on enhance with the graphics mode selected. The antlers look much more detailed as well, or at least part of the antlers do. But here's the problem. Look at the foliage. So first, let's do it without enhance. So again, this is just the automatic noise removal. But look at the foliage back here in the kind of upper left. Watch what happens when I turn on enhance. The subject gets better, but now we're introducing a whole bunch of artifacting back here. So that's interesting that it would actually do a good job on the moose, but a poor job on the plants back here. You can kind of see it on these flowers as well. Might be harder to pick up in the recording, but I'm seeing some pretty harsh outlines on these flowers that if you watch them as I turn it off, it's not drastic on and off, If you watch this little blade of grass right here, right now that looks pretty good. When I turn on enhance, it is introducing some artifacting. So I think, yeah, that's a mixed bag. So let's turn enhance off and see what sharpen does in terms of sharpening up the subject, and do we still get some of that artifacting in the other areas we don't want. So we'll let it do its thing. Okay, this is what I would have expected to see as a default result without me having to do anything. So I turned sharpening off. Watch that eye. Without sharpening, with sharpening. It's subtle, and you can see a pretty decent change in the fur as well. So sharpening's off, turn it on. Definitely getting some more detail within the fur. Now we are getting some artifacting in here in this particular portion of the body. So, maybe I need to pull it back a little bit and let it recalculate. And now this is with sharpening, without. We're still seeing subtle improvement on the eye, but we're definitely getting artifacting in the fur. Now, subject only is on, so let me turn that off and just have it do sharpening on the entire image. I don't think that's making any difference in terms of the artifacting we're getting in the fur. So this is the stuff you have to watch for. Even if you're using the standalone sharpening app, this is the stuff you got to watch for. And this, to me, is still the biggest issue with Topaz Labs AI solutions in general, is especially on the sharpening, I see this artifacting a lot where it just gets crunchy looking. There's too much contrast being brought in or something. So I can't say this is a problem specifically to Photo AI, because I do see this in the standalone sharpening app. And honestly, it's why I probably use DeNoise more than anything, because DeNoise does its own sharpening. So yeah, a little bit of a mixed bag. Let's take a look at lens blur instead of motion blur and see what we get. I think if we bounce between the two, looking at that fur, there's really no difference there. Let's just go crazy and turn it up. What's probably going to be way too much. So again, I think the face looks good. I think the antlers look pretty good. It's just really, in terms of the subject itself, it's the fur in here. Let's move this over and see how the rest of it's looking. If I'm being honest, as I look at it with the rest of the body in there, that artifacting is probably not as problematic. Now we're definitely getting some odd artifacts around these little blades of grass. If you look at the before, the actual raw file, those are single blades, but now we're seeing almost like some ghosting in there. Let me take this up to 200% so you can see that. Interesting enough, it doesn't look as bad at 200%. There's still something going on there. You can see some funkiness in this particular region of that blade in particular. If I turn off sharpening, I bet that'll go away. Yeah, so this is with only the noise reduction that was determined by the AI algorithm, whatever you want to call it. So there's none of that artifacting there with just the noise reduction. It's as soon as we pull in sharpening that we get that. And we'll see. It's probably still going to be there on the lens blur, I bet, too, but maybe I'm wrong. It's different, but there is still something going on there. It's adding, it's almost like it's adding a fur detail just on the outside of this blade of grass here. There's a little bit of something coming in under the arch here. It's kind of, there might actually be data in the noise there. But yeah, it's kind of making up its own story there, especially along this one. You can almost see kind of a ghost. If I bring the strength down, had it at 50, let's bring it down half. It's better, but yeah, still not quite the result. Now, guess what I'm going to say? It's beta, and we're looking at it at 200 freaking percent. So not necessarily a realistic use case here. So let's take it back to 100%. We'll give it its moment to do its thing. You know, at 100%, it doesn't look too bad. Let's go ahead and pull this into Lightroom and see what we get. I think what I want to do though, let's turn off sharpening. Let's just use the autopilot settings that it determined automatically on its own. So all it's doing is removing noise. So let's leave it at that. We can take a look at the normal noise reduction level and see if that's any better. I might actually like that better. That's strong, normal. I think if we look at like this part of the face below the eye, I think normal's retaining some of that contrast in there a little bit better. Look at strong versus normal. Let's look at the antlers. So normal, you know, I think this fur is looking pretty good. The details in here are looking pretty good. If I take this to strong and normal, strong versus normal. You know, honestly, again, this is where I say a lot of times I use these AI tools and I pull them back from what they automatically determine, even in the standalone apps. I think this is an example of that. I think the normal noise reduction here looks better. Is there still some noise in there? Yeah, I mean, if I nitpick, there is, but I mean, here's the original raw file. That's a heck of a lot better. And again, we're at 100%. Looking at this at our normal size, that's going to look like a clean file, and I think we've got better details in there. So let's take this back with we're not using the autopilot settings. We're going to override it and say, nope, you did too much. We're going to use normal. So let's save it. And we can take it side by side in Lightroom, but it should be pretty much the same thing as we're seeing here. So here we've got our corrected file, zooming in at 100%. Yeah, that's pretty good looking. Let's grab our original here and compare. I did that backwards. So now our original's on the left, the raw file's on the left, the cleaned up file's on the right. Yeah, I mean, I think taking that from strong noise reduction to normal, it's the right balance of cleaning up the file, but leaving some of the details that were getting inadvertently removed. Yeah, I'd be happy with this. I'd be happy to work on this file if I thought it was a better image to begin with. But I think this has done a more than adequate job. I mean, I'm really not seeing any noise in the foreground here, even with reducing that noise reduction in the Topaz Photo AI tool. We've got good details throughout here. I'm not seeing really any kind of artifacting. It hasn't oddly messed with depth of field blur or anything like that. I think that is pretty acceptable. We can again take it up to 200% or so. You know, we turned that sharpening and photo AI back off. We don't have that weird artifacting in here around these grass blades. Again, yeah, there is some noise when we zoom in all the way at 200%, but you know, that is a huge improvement over the original raw file. And for the sake of the details that we retain, I think this is the right way to go. And if I really wanted to, let's take this modified file, which I haven't selected. Let's take the modified file. Let's try that again. Here's the modified file. And we're going to zoom back out to 100%. And let's apply some Lightroom sharpening. So, I mean, here now we're seeing we've already removed out a lot of the noise with Photo AI. Now I'm coming in and applying additional sharpening in Lightroom, and we're getting some of that detail back. You know, we probably still want to do some masking, so we're getting more just the edge details. And this is probably too subtle to see on the recording, but I think that does a good job of bringing in some of that sharpening or some of that sharpness that was quote unquote lacking coming out of Photo AI. So yeah, I mean, I think this is a pretty good result. We don't see any weird purple artifacting like we saw in the previous photo. You know, some of the sharpening in Photo AI, yeah, I think it was being too aggressive in the fur, so we canceled that out, but it didn't automatically detect that that was needed. So, you know, to me as a human being looking at it, I say, well, why isn't it applying sharpening? But, you know, this is a pretty good outcome for what the tool is really trying to do. You know, it didn't apply sharpening because that would have been too aggressive, essentially. So, yeah, AI knows best. All right, this is, I know this is getting lengthy. Let's take a look at a couple others. Let's look at this one real quickly. This has got obviously some really fine details. I think there's some opportunity for maybe some of that artifacting that we saw with the moose and those blades of grass coming in. We've got some chromatic aberration in here. This was shot with Tamron 150 to 600, which is a good lens, but it is more susceptible to some chromatic aberration, especially at the far end. I shot this all the way at 600 millimeters. And this is ISO 800. So the noise isn't terrible in this one. It's a little soft. So let's see what it does on something subtle like this. And we'll remember to turn off the default sharpening in Lightroom this time before we go into Photo AI. Okay, it's done doing its evaluation, and it says subject detected, so we'll take a look at that. No faces, obviously. Subject is in focus. Luminance noise level is medium. So yeah, this wasn't a terribly noisy file. It was shot at ISO 800, but in pretty good light, so the noise wasn't hugely problematic. I just discovered that your scroll wheel on your mouse will zoom you in and out, so FYI, good to know. Let's look at before and after. I'm going to guess it thinks that tree branch or trunk, whatever this was, is the subject. Let's look at that. No, interesting. Let's zoom out a bit and see. Okay. So that kind of makes sense, actually, that it's detecting this entire web structure and the twigs or branches, whatever, here as the subject. Yeah, I can't argue with that too much. Let's see what it does up on the upper edge here. Okay. Yeah, would I love to see red only on the actual webs? Sure, but I also got to be somewhat realistic here. So I think this is a fair outcome for subject detection. Before and after, yeah, I mean, it's removing noise. Let's zoom back into we'll go to 200% so you can see. And let's look at some of these details here. So even though it's only doing remove noise, if you watch the tree structure here, the before the raw file, that's pretty blurry looking. So even though it's only removing noise, it is definitely bringing in some detail, some sharpness that wasn't there before. What's interesting, and I gotta say, it makes me pretty happy, is it's doing a decent job of removing that chromatic aberration too. If you look along the webs, and especially this little area, whatever this mess is here in the raw, there's some pretty good purple fringing in there. And it's basically pulling that out. It's even, if you look at this web here, the top edge of it and the before in the raw file, there's some green fringing as well from chromatic aberration, and it's pulling that out also. So, especially at 200%, where we're really being nitpicky, I think that's a pretty good result. It's not messing with the webs where they're falling in and out of light and shadow, so it's not trying to clean that up as part of the chromatic aberration or something weird. So that's good. You can see around this little bright spot down here in the raw file, there's some pretty good purple fringing on that. That's basically gone in the cleaned up version. Let's drag the box and take a look over here. So here we can see there's a whole lot of chromatic aberration in the raw file. So let me let go and let it do its thing. Okay, so here it's not fixing the aberration that's showing up in this particular spot, but it did a really good job in other spots. And on it, this would probably be tough even if I did it within Lightroom. That's a pretty messy batch of color being introduced to the file. So I don't know that I can be too nitpicky there. But again, if you look at this bigger, I think that's a spindle of web. The before, you see on the left upper side of it, there's quite a bit of yellowish green fringing and pinkish purple on the bottom. But when we look at the after, it's done a pretty good job of cleaning it up. So I think for the level of chromatic aberration that's in this file, I'd say overall it's done a really good job of cleaning that up as part of the noise reduction process. And of course, any of the grain that's in these darker shadows is just completely removed. So that's obviously a great result there. So I think this one, I'm not seeing any graphical glitching or anything like that. It's not removing any part of the web details. Like even here, I don't know if that's a shadow striking it or if there's something on the web, but it's still leaving that faint little dim bit of web here instead of removing it completely and just having it blend into the background. So it did a good job with that. It's doing a good job with keeping these real fine details here that, we zoom out to 100%. They look good there. These are probably lens spots that I need to clean up. Yeah, overall in this one, I think we could call this a success. Again, would I like to see the web sharpened? Sure. When I go into Lightroom and look at it in normal size, am I going to notice that there's still some softness there? Probably not really. And I can probably add in some sharpening to bring some of that detail out. Again, just for curiosity's sake, let's see what Enhance does. Yeah, no good. It's adding in a bunch of weird artifacting. If you look at the webs in here, we're getting some duplicate lines and edging, whatever you want to call it, that shouldn't be there. Let's see what it does with the other versions. I don't know that we're getting anything out of natural. And on graphics, yeah, here we're getting too aggressive. Well, I was going to say remove part of the web, but looking at it in the raw file, actually, there's no web detail there. I do feel it's probably a little it feels overly aggressive, which means it probably is. And again, that's something I see even on the standalone apps. Like sometimes I actually go in and I add grain back in because I think they're just weirdly too clean looking when they come out. I think in the bark here, with the graphics enhance mode, it's adding in some over crunchiness, for lack of a better way to put it. But actually, I mean, overall, this is a rather intriguing result we're getting. I just suspect it's a little too aggressive. I don't necessarily like what it's doing in here. So let's turn that off. And again, you've still got the ability to do some tweaking of your own. So let's see what it does with sharpening. I like what it's doing to these really fine webs that are running from inside to outside. But again, I think it's doing too much on the main or on the thicker webs here. I'll try lens blur. Yeah, I think it's just pushing it a little bit too far, and the strength is already really low at only 7, so not going to be much room to pull that back at all. So let's turn that off. We're using the automatic settings again. So, again, I think overall this is a pretty nice result. Let's kick it back into Lightroom. And here we are looking at the TIFF. This branch is out of focus, but it should be. That's depth of field. There's some detail recovered in the main trunk here. I think the web looks good. Let's compare. So we've got the Photo AI version on the left and the original raw file on the right. Zooming in. There's a definite improvement in the bark. Definitely far more sharpness pulled in there. We can see in the raw file there's some really strong greens and purples in this upper left spot of the web that we saw in the Photo AI tool when we were looking at it. Those are really strong aberrations. They're still present in the Photo AI version, but they are cleaned up somewhat. So, a small tick mark for Photo AI. And again, the noise itself is just completely gone. So no qualms there. And this is honestly an example where I'd probably add some grain in, just personal preference. But, I do think looking at them zoomed out all the way, and I'm almost positive you're not going to be able to see this on YouTube, but looking at it, there is a subtle, visible improvement in the sharpness of the web, I think. I may just be psyching myself into thinking that because I know we've run it through a tool. But I think looking at it fully zoomed out, there may be some improvement there. And again, if we go in like a crazy person at 200%, it's done a fantastic job of retaining the details while cleaning up the noise, not introducing any artifacting. We're not losing any of these fine little details. Keep in mind, we're at 200%. Like, that's absurd. And, these little variances in luminosity along this thin web are retained. There's a little bit of artifacting in these darker areas. But if we go back to 100%, you can't see me, but I'm basically squinting at the screen. There's a little bit of artifacting right in here where there's some blotchiness in the color. But nothing you're going to see at normal viewing. And that might even, if I apply a little bit of grain back in, that might help smooth that out a little bit too. And again, I could come over here to develop, bring in some sharpening. Again, probably too subtle to see on screen, on the screen recording, but that's pulling some of that sharpness back in. So out of the ones we've looked at so far, I think this is probably the best result, which honestly kind of surprises me. I thought this would be the trickiest one for it. You know, even here again, shadow, whatever it is on this web, but there's still just that faint remnant of, yes, there is web there. It's just dark and all that noise is cleaned up, but that faint little hint of the web is still there in the Photo AI version. So yeah, I mean, I think out of our examples so far, this is our most impressive one. Let's look at one or two more. I am fully aware that this is a lengthy video, but I'm hoping you're getting getting value out of it. Let's look at this one. Go back to our normal view. So this is another ISO 800. This was another one shot with the Tamrod 150 to 600, all the way out at 600. This was with, this was with my older 80D, so Canon crop sensor. And I have always, I kind of like this photo. I've tried working on it in color. I've tried working on it in black and white, because there's not a lot of color interest in this, but it's always been noisier than I've been able to recover acceptably within the Lightroom tools. So let's go in. I've got nothing other than defaults applied in here. Let's just go ahead and take that off too. And run it through. All right, so here we've got a different scenario. It's detected a subject. It's the moon and tree. So not great, but yeah, we'll call it moderately acceptable. No faces, but this time it does detect that the subject is out of focus. So that's the first time we've seen that. Luminance noise level is low. Yeah, I'd say that's fair. This was ISO 800, but in pretty good light, so the noise isn't terrible. So I'm just going to give it a rating right up front of mixed bag. The moon, I think it's done a great job on. It's sharpened up those edges, retaining the texture on the edges of the moon, but cleaning them up, removing the noise. That looks good. This part of the tree, I think, is a nice improvement. But then down here, it's not doing anything. I wonder, let's look at Sharpen. That's why. So this is, I don't know if it's applying the subject mask or the subject only rule automatically, or if that's just always the default on any image, whether it's doing sharpening or not. But I got a hunch. Let's watch this lower left area here where the tree still looks fuzzy or blurry. Right now, we're masking that area out because it's not part of the mask. So I bet we disable this and that's going to sharpen it up. And I was right. So now if we look at before and after, that's some pretty nice improvement. Even if you look at this edge of the moon here, you got subtle crater details in there. It's cleaning those up and retaining those details. The rock face is definitely a lot sharper and a lot cleaner. The detail in the shrubs and the tree are really nicely recovered. Let's look at another area here. Let's come up here. So we've got before and after. Definite improvement in the sharpness of the tree and these shrubs along the top of the rock face. the rock face itself. Let's look at the hillside. Yeah, that looks raw file, fixed file. I think that looks pretty good. Since you're watching a screen recording, let's go crazy and zoom into 200. So at 200, it doesn't look so hot, but there's your before. And I notice even though it says noise level is low, it's not doing anything on noise reduction here. It's strictly applying the sharpening. And I think this is looking pretty darn good. Let's go back to 100. Let's look at this area. We got some nice details on the rocks there. Yeah, I think this is another solid win for Photo AI. I don't see any reason to do any noise removal. I don't see any reason to mess with the enhance on this go round. I think this is a nice clean result. So let's kick it over to Lightroom. I think that's a pretty good looking file at 100%. Let's pull up the raw and compare. At this level, yeah, I can't tell. But once you zoom in, there is a definite improvement. You look at the clarity around the tree versus on the original raw file. That's done a pretty darn good job. And this is the kind of stuff, when it hits really, really well. And even though it didn't identify any noise, there's a lot of noise in the sky here that's completely gone. And if I bring it over to the moon, oops, same thing. There's a lot of graininess. Take it in a little bit more so you can see it better. And you see all the blotchiness and graininess from the slightly higher ISO, and that's all cleaned up here in the Photo AI version. Now again, there is some blockiness, splotchiness, whatever you want to call it, right in this area. I'm not sure you're actually going to even be able to see that. I can see it, but again, screen recording, don't know. But the disclaimer, yet again, we're at 200% here, almost 200%, 186% zoom. You're going to see a lot of flaws that you'll never see in real viewing scenarios. Take that back to 100. So even at 100, if I'm being honest, you can still see some of that stuff coming in. So maybe not quite as good as I thought originally, but that's pretty nice. And the other thing is I'm looking at this in library, which doesn't always give you the quality. And sure enough, okay, Topaz, I apologize. Now that I've brought it into the develop module, all that splotchiness is gone. So if I pull this up to almost 200 again, okay. So yeah, that splotchiness was entirely the result of viewing it within library module instead of develop. So I retract my former statement. This has done a really, really good job on this particular image in both cleaning up the noise, but also improving your sharpness. If I look at the original here, again, just a really, really nice improvement on this one. So side note, let that be a lesson. When you're in library view, you're not getting your full quality image as if you're in develop module. So keep that in mind. Okay, we're at about an hour and a half. Let's look at one or two more. I know I said that last time. Let's look at this Yosemite one. Let's see. So this one, this is an image I ran through the standalone version of DeNoise back in 2020. So it was using an older version of DeNoise. And I was quite happy with how it did on this one. This is actually an image where I did add some grain back in. Let's jump over to develop. And, this was shot at ISO 6400. I had intended to stack this with multiple frames to do a median noise reduction in Photoshop. And I decided to just throw it into Topaz DeNoise and see what it did. And I honestly, I was so happy with the results. I just used one frame. But yeah, I believe this is one that I did add. Yeah, I added a little bit of grain in because I felt it was quote unquote too perfect. And I didn't do any sharpening. I did do some additional noise reduction in Lightroom after the DeNoise application. But yeah, I was really happy with this result. Here's the original. You can see this was at 6400 and it's pretty much a mess. A lot of noise. So since we've got this one already done with an older version of the standalone DeNoise app, let's run this one through and see what we get with new Photo AI. So it's detected a subject. It'll be interesting to see what it thinks the subject of this is. It's in focus, which I would agree with. And image noise is severe. Well, yeah, definitely. And now I'm kind of cheating on this. I've run this one through Photo AI before, although it was a previous version of the beta. But I know that it did a great job, and this looks even better than what I did, granted, 2 years ago. But 2 years ago in DeNoise AI standalone, the details retained in the trees down here are far better, I feel, than what I got 2 years ago. Look at El Capitan. I mean, that's incredible looking. That looks like a daytime ISO 100 shot of that rock face. You look at Half Dome in the background, perfectly cleaned up. If anything, I say maybe it's a little too clean. You look at the rainbow and the waterfall, it's retained that while pulling in all that detail. The rock face just looks phenomenal compared to where it started. The sky looks great. We're not losing stars, which I think is one of the most impressive aspects of this. And DeNoise did a really good job with that too. But you've got some really faint stars. I would suspect you can't even really see them on the screen recording. But there's some real, just above the hand cursor here, there's some real faint stars in there. And it's managed to retain those. Now there might be one here getting pulled out. Yeah, I can't fault it for that though. Those are so faint. Honestly, I don't know if it's noise or a star. So yeah, who am I to judge? It's leaving these wispy clouds, not messing with them at all. Yeah, it's done a really impressive job with cleaning up the noise. And again, we'll compare it in Lightroom to the version I did 2 years ago, but eyeballing it right here, I feel that the detail pulled, or not necessarily pulled into, but retained in the trees while cleaning up the noise is way better. Maybe I'm being too enthusiastic. Significantly better, we'll call it, than what I got out of DeNoise AI. So I'm going to, let's see what it did here. So it chose normal, which is interesting because it identified it as severe noise, but it did normal noise reduction instead of strong. I'm going to pull this back just a little bit. Still looks really good. I'd probably still add some grain in Lightroom, if I'm being honest. But yeah, man, this I am so impressed with what it's doing on the rock face and in the landscape details. It's really, really impressive. Ton of color noise, ton of high ISO noise, and it's cleaning that all up. Still looks great back in Lightroom. Let's compare it to the raw. Yeah, I mean, that's great. It's let me know if you disagree in the comments, but I think this result is just phenomenal. The little fine details in these trees that when you look at the original raw file at 6400 ISO, I mean, if I just had a cropped version of those trees, I wouldn't necessarily know that they were trees as opposed to some weird color noise or something. And yet in this photo AI output, it's nailed it. I mean, really, really good. This is when the price of admission is worth every single penny, when you get the results like this. Now, if we compare it to the original DeNoise AI from 2 years ago, let's make that my primary. So you look at the trees, and I know obviously they're not edited the same, they're not cropped the same, because we're literally dealing with the raw file on the right, or the modified raw file on the right. But you look at the detail on the trees, it's subtle, but I'm seeing better detail in these little hints of tree trunks. You look in here, again, subtle, but there's definitely some better detail in the trunks, especially in this particular area in the two images. Really impressive. So what I'll do, if you're still watching, what I'll do is apply my final edits to this newly cleaned up version from Photo AI on the right here, so that we can really compare apples to apples in the downloadable file I throw together for you all. But yeah, I mean, this one has just done a phenomenal job. Really, really happy with how it turned out. All right. I'm going to be annoying and say, let's look at two more. One, because I want to see how it does with face detect, which we haven't done yet. Two, because I want to look at this last one on the far right. This is an image that I just worked on, and I'm going for a high key look, which pulled in a lot of noise on an otherwise pretty clean file. So I want to see how it treats that too. But let's look at this one first from a recent photo shoot I did. This one, just a little bit of softness in his face. It's a pretty clean file. It is ISO 640, but we're in pretty good light, so that wasn't a huge concern. A little bit of noise in the shirt and the face, but main thing is it's a little bit soft. And he's got a lot of fine detail in the beard. There's some noise in these lampshades. But I want to see how Photo AI does with face detect and what it does with cleaning it up. All right, so it did detect the face. We can see down here in the lower left, initializing face refine. So far, we've seen it's detected a subject, spot on. It's detected a face, perfect. The subject is out of focus, I would agree. Noise level is low, I would agree with that as well. And I think that's pretty good. It is pulling out. We're losing detail in the beard just below his jawline where it starts falling into some shadow. It's treating that almost like noise instead of detail. But I think it's doing a good job sharpening up the face that otherwise was a little soft. You know what else it's doing? It's pulling details out of his very short hair on the side here. If you look at that, it's making him a little bald instead of just cut short. So let's see what face recovery is doing. So if I click on this, I do have a strength slider. So let's see if that pulls in some of those details. We'll just go half-ish. Yeah, I think we're retaining more details down, at least in some of the beard down here. It's still pulling some of them out, but I don't think it's as extreme as it was at 100. But we are still losing, if we look at the original, let me just toggle it on. Now there's some real fine hair running up through here that we're still losing. It's getting, that looks kind of AI generated. It's getting a little too smoothed out there, I think. Pulling it back is doing a better job down here, but we're definitely losing some of that detail we should have up here. Let's try pulling it back to 20. I mean, it's doing a really good job of sharpening the eyes, cleaning that up where there's some softness. The mouth and teeth are getting nicely cleaned up and sharpened. It's doing a good job on his goatee and the rest of the beard. At 20, we're keeping, I think, sufficient detail down here now. And I think we're keeping enough detail here now as well. If you look at before and after, we're really not losing anything there. It's just getting cleaned up with some of the graininess. Again, keeping in mind we're at 200%. So if we take this back to 100%, let it redo its thing. Before and after, before and after. It's subtle, but it's definitely an improvement. Granted, we've pulled it back because it was a little too aggressive, but I would rather it be too aggressive than have it be fully maxed out and needing more, because then you're stuck. At least with it being too aggressive, you can pull it back and dial it down some. See, I think that looks good. The nice thing here is, even though we were fighting losing some detail that we shouldn't have been losing, if I go back to 200, it's retaining these little wispy, flyaway beard hairs here. It could easily be removing those as part of this cleanup and sharpening, and it's not touching them, so that's a good sign. Same thing all along here. It's keeping those little details in there. So yeah, I think that's a good looking result. Let's kick it back to Lightroom. Yeah, so here in Lightroom at 100%, I think that's a good looking file. You want to know it's been cleaned up. To me, this just looks like a clean in focus raw file at this point. And at the end of the day, it is a subtle difference, but it's definitely noticeable. I mean, yeah, I would say this is another one where, yes, we had to tweak it a little bit, but I think this is a really, really impressive result here. Let's look at those lampshades. We didn't look at that. So yeah, okay, fine. There's a little bit of graininess in these still. Might be a little bit better than the raw, but very much nitpicking. Zoomed at 100%. That is something, a little bit of Lightroom noise reduction would easily clean that up. But the most important part, nobody's looking at the lampshades in a photo like this. I think that's done a really good job on cleaning up the face. It didn't remove any of the natural textures in his skin. It's retained all that. By pulling it back, we retained the details in the beard and this hair on the side of his head that we needed. But we've got the additional sharpness and just general cleaned up that we needed. So I think that's another good result from Photo AI. All right, one more. We'll take a look at this one where the noise was introduced because of taking it to such a high key level, high key meaning I've pushed the histogram to the right to give it a very bright, airy feel. This is only at ISO 400 on my Canon R5, which is nothing for that camera. But if we zoom in, it's a little, it's probably going to be a little hard to see again on the screen recording, but there is some artifacting in here and a little bit of noise. Now I copied this as a virtual copy, so I do have my details modified. So let me clear out noise reduction, reset sharpening. Actually, let's go all the way here. Let's just turn off sharpening completely. So now we've got the totally unaltered raw level of noise reduction and sharpening. So you can see that tree trunk, not the mulch, the bark, that's the word. The bark is a little soft. So that's what I was trying to fix and address by lifting the sharpening up to 71 points. But we were getting some minor artifacting in there. So for the last time in this overly long video, let's take it on into Photo AI. Okay, so this one, no subject detected. I would argue that tree is the subject, but I can live with that. No faces, obviously. Subjects in focus, I would agree with that. Luminance noise level is severe. I don't agree that it was severe, but what matters is the result we got. So let's just look at before and after. It is bringing in the contrast and details that I was trying to recover with Lightroom sharpening without introducing any weird artifacting, which I was getting in Lightroom a little bit, but again, zoomed at 100%, not something I would notice in a print or normal viewing on a phone, certainly, but even on my monitor, unless I zoom in, I couldn't see it. But the fact remains, this is doing a better job. Let's pull it over here and see how it did. Yeah, I mean, this one is really subtle. What I don't like on this, I like what it's doing on the main tree structure. It's definitely getting some detail in there and some good contrast in the bark that I like. What I don't like is what it's doing over here. So if you watch this section here right now with the remove noise applied at the automatically detected level, these fine branches that should be very wispy are getting a little over defined. So if I look at the original, they're nice and faint. That's what I wanted. I want this to be a very ethereal, kind of dreamy take on this photo. And it's pulling in way too much edge contrast there. It's doing it a little bit down here, although I could live with that. But I definitely don't like what it's doing in these really faint areas. It's not terrible, but it's not what I want in this image. This is probably the worst spot right here. It's doing a little bit up here, but I could live with that in the final version. This is too aggressive for my liking for the style I'm trying to go for. This right in here, same thing. It's too aggressive. Now, could I go into Lightroom masking and pull that contrast back out, lift the blacks and fix it? I am 99% certain that yes, I could easily fix that in Lightroom. Ironically, the other problem is there's a little bit of detail right here that it's getting rid of. So there's my original that I pulled in from Lightroom. And it's removing some of that. So it's not quite consistent. I will give it a bit of a pass. This is really, I mean, those are some pretty darn fine details. But yeah, it looks like, I wonder if it's doing anything like that over here. Yeah, it's adding a little bit too much edge contrast on this little wispy spot here. Again, very subtle. I could easily fix that, I'm sure. If we look in here, the before, you can see some graininess, or at least I can see some graininess in the darker tones of the bark here that gets pulled out nicely. So it's doing a good job there. So other than a couple spots where it's putting in that little bit too much on the edge contrast, I think it's doing pretty good. Let me take this to 200 just so you can kind of see. So here's the before. You look at the darker patches of bark in here. It's getting cleaned up pretty nicely and retaining the detail pretty well. Might be losing a little more detail than I would like right in here. But again, at 100%, at normal viewing distances, I don't think you're going to really notice that loss. And overall, yeah, I mean, like I said, other than a couple little spots where it's getting a little too aggressive with almost pulling detail back in, here, I'd say it's doing pretty well. This is a pretty tough photo for an AI to try to figure out what's going on, or so I assume. Now I could also pull this back. So maybe I just want to do 25 instead of the automatically defined 50. What's interesting is it's still doing just as much adding in of contrast there. So this might be an example of one where I wouldn't actually mess with running it through here. I mean, I do really like the job it's done in cleaning up the main tree structure. So I don't know, maybe I would. Let's reset it to autopilot settings, kick it into Lightroom, we'll look at them side by side. So here in Lightroom at 100%, I think it looks really, really good. If we come over to that area where it was pulling in too much contrast, I think it was this area, but you know what? It doesn't look as bad in here as I remember it being. Maybe it is. Let's go into library and compare. Okay, so there definitely is more contrast on these kind of underside shadows through here. Looking at it side by side, it doesn't bother me as much. And I mean, zoomed out to, again, a normal viewing, you can tell just a little bit. You can see a little bit more of this little twig sticking out right here compared to over here. This branch is maybe just slightly darker, but at normal viewing here, and I'm on a 27-inch monitor, and I would be hard pressed to tell you that there's a worrisome difference there. But if I look at the bark, again, it's subtle, but it's a definite improvement from what we have over here, especially as I come up into some of these darker tones. Could maybe make an argument that maybe it got a little too aggressive in here. That looks a little blurry, almost as if you're looking through shallow water at it. Let's do some pixel peeping. See, I think right in this area, kind of right through here, I think it's gotten a little too aggressive with the noise reduction. Now, maybe if I added some grain back in, maybe 5-10 points of grain, it would offset that. But again, I'm at 200%. So I'm really nitpicking here. Normal viewing, never going to notice that. Printing it out at a normal viewing distance, never going to notice that. You could even argue that you're never going to notice that the image on the left is a little bit cleaner and sharper in the tree structure than the image on the right, because looking at it on 27-inch screen, I can't tell. I would bet that printing this out, especially on the fine art paper I like to use that's got some texture, never going to notice. So that's something else, and I'll wind this down. This overly long in-depth look at Photo AI. I'll wind this down with whether you're using this new Photo AI all-in-one, quote-unquote, automated one-click tool, or you're using Topaz DeNoise as a standalone, or Sharpen AI as a standalone. It is really easy to fall into a trap of pixel peeping to the extreme. If you're having to zoom in to 200% to see the difference, you're probably worrying about nothing. If you're having to zoom into 100% to see a noticeable difference or a significant difference, you might still be worrying about nothing. Because at the end of the day, let's be realistic, 99% of the time, our work is being viewed on a phone. Nobody's going to notice these really, really subtle fine details. When you print, a lot of quote unquote flaws, little bits of noise from ISO 400 or 800, you're not going to notice it when you print. Nobody's holding a print up to their nose and looking for grain. If they are, that's their problem. So just something to keep in mind. All of that said, I understand this video may not have been a ringing endorsement for Photo AI, especially on those first examples we looked at. The subject masking was, let's be honest, a mess. On the dog photo, sharpening, I feel, was too aggressive, even dialing it back. It was still creating some artifacting, some chunkiness, crunchiness, whatever you want to call it, that I'm not a big fan of. But as we got into some of those other examples, the one with the moon rising over the ridgeline, the tunnel view example at night, I mean, that's a phenomenal example. The portrait example, I think it did really well on. I think this is a realistic representation of what you get with these kind of tools. I don't think Photo AI is necessarily doing anything worse than DeNoise standalone or Sharpen AI standalone. Your results just vary. That's the nature of it. The AI is interpreting the image and trying to determine what is what and what it needs to do to clean the image up. So even though this is a beta version of Photo AI, I wouldn't necessarily look at some of the flaws that we ran into, aside from the subject masking. To me, that is a legitimate flaw that hopefully is just a flaw within the beta version and will be fixed with the release, or they'll add in the ability to adjust subject mask and add in masking things in and out as you've got in the standalone apps by the time this comes out. But as far as the sharpening and the noise reduction, I think this is pretty darn close, if not on par, with what you get in the standalone versions. You do get more ability to refine and adjust in the standalone versions, but 200% zoomed in pixel peeping aside, I think this is giving really good results. And what I like about this so much is I don't have to worry about which app do I need to use. I edit in Photo AI. If it needs noise reduction, I can get noise reduction. If it needs sharpening, I can get sharpening. If it needs a little bit of both, I can do a little bit of both. As opposed to previously looking at an image and maybe I'm not sure, do I need to attack this in DeNoise? And it also needs sharpening, so hopefully DeNoise can get me the sharpening I need as well as the noise cleanup. Or am I going to have to run it through DeNoise and then run it separately through Sharpening AI? And now I'm going through two processes and generating additional files and all that mess. Or do I just run it through Sharpen AI and hope I get the sharpening and the appropriate noise cleanup all in that app? There's definitely a lot to like about the direction they're heading here. Is this going to be perfect for every single image? No. But guess what? None of the AI tools out there, whether it's Topaz or DxO or Luminar's got a new noise extension for their Neo that's either out or coming out, none of them are perfect. They're not going to have a 100% hit rate right now. They're getting better all the time. You saw the improvement in the last 2 years from the Yosemite photo I ran through Photo DeNoise or DeNoise AI 2 years ago to the results we got out of Photo AI today in a beta version that I would argue is better. It should be better. It's 2 years further on. So all things to keep in mind, but overall, I do get value and I see the value in these applications. And I think Photo AI is the next step. Stop making us figure out which is the right app to use and just let us do it in one app, an all-in-one solution, a hopefully one-click solution. But if it doesn't nail it on its own, then you've got the ability to do some minor tweaks and variability of sliders and all that stuff to dial it in and get it to where you're happy with the results. So anyways, I'm going to run through all, I believe it was 28 photos originally. I'm going to generate output from Photo AI and put it all into a document with screenshots so you can compare zoomed in, all that good stuff, and see what you think. Don't quote me on it, but I think I will, at least on some of them, also do comparisons with the standalone DeNoise AI and or Sharpen AI apps. So you can see how Photo AI stacks up against the standalones as well. But I'm hoping this has given you some insight into how these tools work, how this new tool works, the extreme benefits you can get out of them, but also some of the gaps that are still there. And again, those gaps exist whether we're doing it in Photo AI or the standalone app. None of these are perfect yet, at least none of them in my experience. Every single one I've seen, whether I've used it myself or I've watched videos on it, there are still gaps. So again, if you've made it this far, thank you so much. Give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, drop a comment below. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you got questions. If you want to try it out for yourself and you're already subscribed to the image quality bundle through Topaz Labs, you can go grab it yourself right now today. They've got instructions on how you got to do it. It's a little bit weird because it's beta. It's not, part of their official downloads or purchases or anything right now. So it is a little bit of a workaround process to get the application. Again, the final version will be available in September. I'll take a second look at it then. If there's anything significant to update, I will certainly put out an updated video and let you all know what's going on with it. If there's new tools added, removed, improved, what have you. And if you don't have the image quality bundle already, but it's something you've been thinking about or you've been on the fence about, again, it is on sale right now for, $60 off. And if you want to use my affiliate link, I would greatly appreciate it, as I do get a little bit of a kickback on that. It's no extra cost to you, but it helps support me and the channel and my passion for photography, all that good stuff. So I am rambling on at this point. I desperately need some water. I'm losing my voice. So thank you for watching. And until next time, take care.